Up next, a discussion on former National Security Advisor and Secretary of State Henry Kissinger. Harper's Magazine recently published 2 articles by Christopher Hitchens accusing Mr. Kissinger of international crimes. Participants at today's National Press Club event included Kissinger staff member Roger Morris, 3 law professors, and Mr. Hitchens. Harper's editor Louis Lapham served as moderator. It's about an hour and a half.
Okay, my name is Louis Lapham. This is a discussion of a 2-part essay appearing in the February and March issue of Harper's Magazine, making the case against Henry Kissinger's record, and written by Christopher Hitchens, who is an author, a columnist for The Nation, author of many books, TV shows, and so on. And we also have Scott Armstrong, another well-known author, formerly the director of the National Security Archive, Stanley Cutler, well-known professor of American history in Wisconsin, the author of many books, most recently of the Nixon tapes and the abuse of power. Roger Morris, who is formerly on the National Security Council with Nixon, again, the author of many books, and most recently I think he's writing one about Las Vegas, if that's correct. Alfred Rubin is the professor of international law at the Fletcher School of Diplomacy in Tufts University, is himself an author of several books, an authority on the old British Empire, is that correct? I think. And the subtext of the discussion this morning is, are we an empire or a democracy? Is there a way, can we behave in the manner of the old Roman Empire and do as we please with the world, drop bombs on people we feel to be communist or seditious in one form or another, or people to be well rid of? In other words, can we behave in an autocratic manner without accountability? That is the record of Mr. Kissinger's career as National Security Advisor and as Secretary of State. Were he a private citizen living in a democracy, he could be brought to justice, conceivably hanged. As a statesman operating under the droit de seigneur of senior statesman, a servant of the American Empire, under the rubric of the Cold War, he escapes all, not censure, but any kind of act of bringing him to account. The piece, the 2 essays written by Christopher in Harper's Magazine present the record of Mr. Kissinger and then raise the question, is it possible to hold such a man accountable? And at the same time, it is raising the question of what kind of country do we think we live in, do we wish to live in? And so, Christopher, you can begin with a brief précis, and then we will work it down the table, starting with Scott and going to Stanley, getting into the questions also of information, what kind of historical record are we making, and does Mr. Kissinger have the right to simply take away from the public domain those records that he feels are too sensitive to be exposed to the American public? And then we will come to Professor Rubin and to Roger Morris. And I hope that we have an audience that is will aggressively ask questions. I would like the various people on the panel to talk for maybe 45 minutes, and then we will open the conversation to questions from the audience, and then I hope that you will address them, your questions, to a specific panelist. and maybe we will have an illuminating morning. You can begin, Christopher.
Thank you, Louis. Well, and thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for coming. I'm acutely conscious of, in the first place, having already had my say, so to speak, at some length, and acutely conscious also of being the only one who stands between you and people who have greater expertise than myself. But I thought I would offer you a play on some recent words which you may have been made to memorize. These words are a peaceful, orderly, democratic transition. You may have heard these words recently uttered in a self-congratulatory, not to say self-regarding manner. You may have had the opportunity to tire of hearing the words peaceful, orderly, democratic transition. You may have wondered why you are so often assured that the great distinction of the United States is that that is what it does or has or can boast of. You may even think it's slightly sinister that you keep on being told that you have a peaceful, democratic, orderly transition tradition. You may wonder even why, if it was so obvious, it had to be restated so often. So I'll stop saying it myself, hoping I've made my play on words point, and direct your attention to two elements only of my folio on Mr. Kissinger. The first being the election of 1968 in these United States. If I can make a claim to, not to originality perhaps, but to a certain synthesis in what I've written, it would be this. I think I can say that Harper's has published for the first time the summa of all the available evidence of how that election was undermined, distorted, fixed by a most appalling piece of cynicism by Richard Nixon and others, in the course of which they went to a foreign military dictatorship, negotiated secretly with that dictatorship to undermine the negotiating position of the American government, the United States government, and its legal and visible negotiators in Paris, made an illegal pact and an amoral pact that this foreign military dictatorship would get a better deal from an incoming Republican administration, and in making this pact took out what one might describe euphemistically as a mortgage or lease on another 4 years of an already proven immoral and atrocious war. The combination of the subversion of that election and the extension of that war as the price of the bargain qualified, I think, to be termed, without any overstatement, the single wickedest act in the history of this republic. And it may be doubted whether it quite qualifies under the tradition of a democratic, peaceful, and orderly transition. Certainly of the four people who concerted that policy, Richard Nixon, Attorney General John Mitchell, Vice President Spiro Agnew, and Henry Kissinger, only one has escaped any kind of indictment so far. John Mitchell was the first Attorney General to go to jail. Richard Nixon had to accept a pardon in order to avoid indictment and impeachment, and Spiro Agnew had to cop a plea also. There's only one unindicted co-conspirator still on the loose. I suggest that's a reproach to a country that considers itself to be bound by law and bound by justice. Democratic, peaceful, orderly transition was also the great boast, and rightly so, of the people of Chile, our southern neighbor, a country that has never offended or threatened to offend or had the capacity to offend or threaten the United States. It was distinguished among its hemispheric neighbors precisely by the fact that when its people had voted, their choice formed the next government, and the armed forces or the police or the oligarchy didn't determine that and couldn't intervene in it. And that will remain the state of affairs until 1970, when it was coldly decided at a meeting in Washington held, among others, by Dr. Kissinger, that there was to be no peaceful, democratic, orderly transition in Chile, that the 60-day constitutionally mandated waiting period between the election of a president, in this case Salvador Allende, and his confirmation, inauguration, would be used for a campaign of murder and subversion in order that that transition not occur. And this involved the cold-blooded planning of the murder of General René Schneider, the head of the Chilean Armed Forces, an honorable conservative and constitutionalist officer in a country which, I repeat, was a democracy, that had open diplomatic relations and trade relations with the United States and posed no threat to it. And that murder is now what a lawyer, I think, could decently call a lay-down case. A lay-down case from soup to nuts. We know who commissioned it, who paid for it, who organized it, who shipped the illegal money, who shipped the dirty weapons to Chile to have this done, and who paid the murderers after the crime had been committed. And the same name and the same face recurs throughout. We charge Henry Kissinger with murder for that, and we say that a society that tolerates him is tolerating that too. And that's therefore a big reproach to a society that claims to be bound by law and responsive to justice. And it's of course, an utter cynical negation of all the claims that have been made about democratic, peaceful, orderly transition. As I said, of the 4 people who conducted the election subversion in 1968, only 1 remains unindicted. If you now look at the international scene and see the people with whom Dr. Kissinger was in business during his tenure in office, you will find that almost all of them also are in jail in their own countries or are going there. Of Mr. Kissinger's business and political partners, Mr. Suharto, General Pinochet, General Papadopoulos in Greece, the brigadiers in Bangladesh who committed the assassination of Sheikh Mujib, and quite a number of others are in jail, I'm glad to say, tried in courts, proper courts in their own countries, and condemned to life imprisonment. Once again, the grand exception is the man who made their political careers or military careers possible, and he dwells as an honored citizen among us, and we say, too, that that is a reproach to any society that considers itself internationally law-bound or responsive to the claims of justice on the international scale. So let that be my opening bid, and let me accept counteroffers from, or enlargements, or
a very strong bid,
undercuts from
Christopher.
These distinguished gentlemen. Thank you.
Scott?
Christopher, I'm not sure this is directly responsive to your bid, but I think I share with you and everyone here a deep concern about accountability in public service. It is a given to me that without high-quality public servants, we will not have even the mere bones of government that we now have. I encourage people that I meet, young people, to go into government. I encourage them to get the experience. I encourage them to persevere. I've even been known to congratulate senior officials on their departure from government, usually for what they don't do, and usually a catalog that I can relay to them about their failure to act in a way that was suggested that would have been worse than what they did. And I find often that they're surprised to be thanked, that they rarely are thanked except by the corporate interests that they're expected to represent. The difficulty of accountability, it seems to me, is that if we don't have an accountability for the past, we will not have people willing to serve in the future. We must make some arrangements and document them that will allow, I think, the debate that we'll have here today to be more clearly focused on individual service. It is a dangerous, violent world out there. We're often told that what public official can avoid regional conflicts, ethnic cleansing, the difficulties and harsh realities that national security decision-making, as it's put forward, is by every administration, which generally seems to me to mean arguments to protect American interests that are not necessarily the interests of the American people, except by virtue of their investment in a corporate society. And these difficulties with dealing with a political leadership that is elected to protect these interests is most dramatically presented in Kissinger's case. There is an adage that I'm afraid we are likely to invert. The adage is to make the punishment fit the crime, and I think now we sometimes are in danger of making the crime fit the punishment. Mr. Kissinger is in the parlance of street protest of the 60s, is already known as a war criminal. we're prepared to punish him as such. Now we find ourselves ordering our facts in order to construct the crimes with which we're prepared, for which we are already prepared to punish him. I have some caution about this. These are not unique actions. They were not covert. They are not Oliver North type government out of control. These, in fact, were very singular in their arrogance. They were openly contemptuous of many constitutional niceties. And Henry Kissinger and those about him were very much in control. These were deliberate manipulations of the levers of power. And it is very much that Henry Kissinger was in the loop. He defined the loop. And Christopher's indictment, if I can call it that, is of an entire administration, stretched by the Nixon resignation into 2 administrations. And those who served with him, above him, across the Potomac, and even in Congress, bear similar measures of responsibility. So what are we to do if we are not just to throw the term war criminal around loosely? We must dig out, analyze, and order the facts, the documentary record, and the forensic explanations that are offered by Mr. Kissinger, by Mr. Nixon, and by virtually every other member of that administration. It is in the bureaucratic context that we find this most interesting, and Henry Kissinger has done something quite remarkable. He's taken the most important of his papers, and he has hidden them in plain sight. He has installed them in the Library of Congress under a deed which makes them inaccessible until the year 2001, or 5 years after his death, and which means no matter how tragic his life may be this year, we're not going to be looking at those for another 5 years. They include authentic telephone transcripts of virtually every important meeting he had. The case that in which this was litigated, the appropriateness of taking government records and putting them into the Library of Congress, is Kissinger against the Reporters Committee. The other plaintiffs were the Military Audit Project and one William Safire of the New York Times. By an unusual majority that actually only had, depending on how you read the opinions, 4 members. It included 2 concurrences and a partial concurrence, and 2 abstentions. We have established a rule of law that allows one to put one's papers out of the reach of the public. General Haig did this. Caspar Weinberger did this. In fact, Caspar Weinberger did it and was indicted for it before he was pardoned by President Bush, because it was seen as an act of deliberate attempt to obstruct justice. The difficulty we now have is that there is an ongoing investigation of General Pinochet. The FBI has been pursuing this more actively than has been publicly reported, but even public reports acknowledge that there's now enough information to indict in the United States General Pinochet. However, the best evidence is evidence that's in the Library of Congress. The FBI is getting that evidence and is getting some access to it, but it has to negotiate with Henry Kissinger's lawyers. These are government records that the United States government, in a criminal investigation, is negotiating access to. There are a variety of things that Kissinger has done that we will find, I think, elucidated by these materials. But the most important aspect is that his staff and he have had complete access to this material. And with a very carefully selected and shaped account, Henry Kissinger has put himself beyond the control of his history, beyond the memory of those who might refute it. It will be very unlikely that in 5 years this material will be accessible. The Library of Congress has conspired to some degree to support this. What are we to do now? How do we approach this? I don't think there are simple answers. We'll hear, I'm sure, in a minute about crimes against humanity and international prosecutions. My concerns are much more American law and the ability to get some sort of truth and reconciliation process. Henry Kissinger's defense, which was quite deliberately articulated just the other night in McNeil Lair, was that much of this was done in the name of the Cold War. And in the Cold, he said, we may have been wrong, but we genuinely believed that we had to do something about Chile and other places to prevent communist takeovers. Well, I think it's time that we understood what the range of those activities were. Christopher's laid them out quite clearly. One of the more interesting rebuttals to the notion that there should be international accountability was given by John Bolton, one of the people from the Reagan administration with such responsibilities, who testified in this administration that this would not be an adequate deterrence to the activities of dictators like Pol Pot or Saddam Hussein, that an international court of criminal justice would not deter them. And yet, I remember sitting and listening to John Deutsch explain that he was very disturbed that the records of a Central Intelligence Agency director before him might be released after 40 years. And his remark was, imagine if those were released. If I knew that those were going to be released, it would change the way I treated my peers in the intelligence community from other countries. It would change my behavior. Precisely so. The notion of accountability seems to be such a shock within government, and it's one of those rare opportunities, I think, to see that the obvious lies right on the surface. And so the empirical issues of chain of command, claims of responsibility, efforts to affect the outcome, the very things that we see in government decision-making are now something that we have an opportunity and I think a responsibility to demand and to call for. Whether it's done by legislation, whether it's done by a commission, I fear a commission and who would appoint a commission, but there needs to be some mechanisms of accountability to lay out the record and complete it that Christopher's begun to describe.
Stanley?
Okay, well, Scott touched on some of the issues I wanted to mention, but reiterate a few of them. First of all, the problem with Christopher's indictment here is that Senator Helms has made it clear that he will block any treaty that would turn any American over to foreigners for war crimes trials. I suspect that Senator Helms might like to make an exception for Henry Kissinger, but not necessarily on Christopher Hitchens' grounds, but ones reflecting his own prejudices and own agenda. Let me just say a few words briefly about the work. It's quite devastating, I think. It's built on a lot of first-rate digging into primary sources, paralleling, I would tell you, a lot of the work that's going on in the scholarly history community these days. You know, the director of the Nixon Library has always argued, just wait till all the good stuff comes out and Nixon's reputation will be rehabilitated. Well, perhaps you're not aware, but there are books, let's say now, on Nixon and the economy, Nixon and agriculture, Nixon and Vietnam, and so forth, all of you which making extensive use of the Nixon papers, which include things of Henry Kissinger as well. And I will tell you, he ain't doing so well. It's very, very clear, I think, where this historical record is going. It would take massive revisionism to turn it around, and I just don't see that in the cards. It's interesting that Christopher touched on a number of issues. There's work on that's been done on Vietnam, some on Chile, but no work on Cyprus among historians, nothing on Bangladesh, and nothing, of course, on the distinguished gentleman from Greece, Elias P. Dimitrakopoulos, of whom Christopher wrote at length, and what happened to him here. Parenthetically, I'd like to just say that when I interviewed John Mitchell a number of years ago, I asked him about Dimitrakopoulos and what he knew about that. This is the man that Christopher points out in the article, whom somebody reported was livid with Dimitrakopoulos and was going to get him and so forth. He told me he was in a very serious mood that day. That was the day that he gave me an advance peek into the notion that there was a prostitute call ring at the Democratic National Headquarters, and John Dean masterminded the whole Watergate break-in, for whom he has an audience of one, namely G. Gordon Liddy. Mitchell told me then that I asked about Dimitrakopoulos. He said, never heard of him, didn't know him. So after, I don't have this on videotape, and it didn't show up on audio tape. When he explained to me his whole notion of Dean masterminding Watergate, I said to him, I said, you can't be serious, and he just winked at me, but I can't record that on audio tape, unfortunately. When we talk about Kissinger's crimes and so forth, one of the things that I think that we have to remember here is that Kissinger was the National Security Advisor. He subsequently became Secretary of State. Now, he bears a great deal of responsibility that things were done, but I'm still a great believer that responsibility begins really at the very top. And if we're going to talk about Kissinger here, we're going to have to talk very, very much about Richard Nixon's culpability in all this. But as Christopher said, Richard Nixon had his comeuppance in terms of the resignation, Spiro Agnew, Mitchell. But you know, the responsibility and accountability is very widespread. Scott briefly alluded to this. What about leaders in Congress? I've always been bemused by this notion of the